The FEC has dismissed claims that Twitter violated election law last October by briefly blocking users from tweeting a damning New York Post article regarding Hunter Biden's dealings while on the board of Burisma, a Ukrainian energy company. According to a document obtained by the New York Times, the FEC determined Twitter's censorship of the reporting was for a, quote, valid commercial reason and not a political purpose.
Published just 20 days before the election in 2020, the Post article alleged that Hunter Biden cashed in on his father's name on Burisma's behalf. Incriminating emails were said to be found on a laptop abandoned at a computer repair shop. Joining us now to discuss the FEC's decision is friend of the show and culture editor at The Federalist, Emily Jashinsky. Emily, welcome.
Hey guys, how's it going?
So Emily, I feel like we're all kind of circling around an idea here, which is that these social media companies are actually kind of public goods or public utilities. Otherwise we wouldn't really have any interest in saying, what they, whether or not they ought to be making these kinds of decisions. I mean, how do you respond to this claim that Twitter and other social media giants did not violate election laws by suppressing this Hunter Biden story?
Well, it seems to me that it's predicated on this false dichotomy that it wasn't political. They had a valid commercial reason. No. They had both. That's what their intent. They think that their product, because they're so dogged by complaints from the censorious people on the left and the people in power on the left, that's why they think they thought it was in their commercial interests to suppress a story. And so to say that it was purely commercial, I think is a mistake. And I don't think it's an unintentional mistake. I think that's when you're stretching and reaching for reasons to protect power, that's the kind of formulation that you come up with. So that's what I see in this decision. But it also speaks to something that when you talk about whether these companies and these platforms are public goods, it raises this question of we don't really have the legal infrastructure to deal with these. We don't have, they're very, very new technologies, and whether or not they're a public good at this point is a completely valid question. I would be terrified to have Twitter operated entirely by the government. I think in some ways that would be worse than Jack Dorsey. But it's an interesting question, and I think it's such an important question because it's what legal concepts what legal concepts at the FEC have ever been used in a way like this before and applying to platforms and companies like this before? It's the same thing in the antitrust conversation. And that's the biggest challenge, I think, moving forward.
Well, I think, Emily, that raises an interesting question for the right, because it was the RNC, I think, that brought this suit, claiming that there was sort of election interference here. Okay, that didn't work. You've seen sort of this flailing about antitrust enforcement, and yet you still had the two Republican commissioners at the FTC vote against bringing suit against Facebook. So you have the right saying, okay, we want to use the tools available to us, but then they don't want to, or they aren't working. And there's a lot of debate now around Section 230 that should sort of information and sort of straight news be protected on these platforms. So do you think at this point the right is sort of running out of excuses to not act on this question?
Well, so Section 230 is such a good example because it's something that it doesn't really apply anymore. And there's other problems. The Section 230 is one of many, many problems with our sort of legal infrastructure for tech right now. But it's not one that really, it doesn't make sense to apply it to these companies in the way that it is. It just is not structured for what we see from tech companies in 2021. And to your point, Rachel, you know this better than I do. Not all Republicans are on board with what the sort of conservative writers who have been having this raging debate about government power and about tech companies and about antitrust issues. Some Republicans talk a big game, especially in the Trump era, in a way to just sort of signal to voters that they're going to be tough and courageous or whatever they think is the right signal to send. But they're not all on board with this. There's a whole lot of money going in the other direction, and there's a whole lot of influence going in the other direction. And so I think the Republican establishment is still, it's interesting you say it was brought by the RNC, because I think the RNC superficially and on the surface, they're ready to rumble. They're down with, amping up the rhetoric. But when it comes to policy, there's still a huge split.
And how does... Just one quick question. Yeah, how does what Texas Republicans did this week? How does that play into this? The Texas Republicans passed this law that says you can't ban, you can't shadow ban and you can't ban conservative viewpoints on social media.
Well, political viewpoints.
Right. Well, at his signing ceremony, he specified conservative viewpoints, but the law does say political viewpoints, but he didn't disguise at all what the purpose was of the legislation. That's some really significant regulation of a private business. So where is the right on that at a national level?
Yeah, that's further than what I would go. I mean, and that's part of the argument in terms of treating these companies like public utilities, or coming up with a legal formula that actually matches what they do. And we don't have that right now. But I think you're completely right to raise that example, Ryan, because it's something Rachel talks about a lot. It's just like, use the levers of government and don't sort of sit back on your rest on your laurels and allow the culture to be completely bulldozed by oligarchs who want to do that so they can enrich themselves in their power. And that's very, very much a mentality that is it's taken root in, I think, some key politicians and constituencies, but it's still, again, it's still a really big divide. And I think there's good arguments on both sides of certain case studies when you get into them, but that mentality itself is important, and it's definitely dividing the right.
Isn't there some sort of in-between here? So rather than just saying, okay, we're going to rip it away and it's going to be run by the government, treating it more like we treat telecom companies or even utility companies, where they are still private, but they are under a regulation where, for example, with my telephone, and this is the issue I have with social media, with my telephone, I can call whoever I want, even if that person is considered totally abhorrent, right? Somebody that is, the leader of a white supremacist group, for example, and they're not allowed to interfere in that phone call and cut it off and say, no, you're not allowed. Or they're not even allowed to go to that person and say, no, we're not going to issue you a telephone, or we're not going to put power on at your home because we don't agree with your political ideology. And my issue with social media is that I choose to follow, for example, let's say the New York Post. I don't know if I really follow them, but let's say I want to follow them, right? So I'm choosing to follow them. That's a choice I've made. So wouldn't I then have the right to see everything they post? That's something I've chosen to do. Or if people choose to be my friend on Facebook, they get to see all of the crazy posts I put up there, but instead what's happening is we've chosen to hear from certain people, like having these telephone conversations. We've chosen to follow certain individuals. And even when we make that choice, they interfere and they take that content and they say, nope, you're not allowed to see this. Like, you're not allowed to hear from your crazy Uncle Joe, and so where does the right stand on that, where there's some sort of an in-between where it's still private, but there's these real controls, treating it more like a telecom company, having that Telecommunications Act sort of used and changed towards social media?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And the right was very galvanized, actually, when Clarence Thomas wrote an opinion suggesting common carrier, the sort of common carrier framework be applied to big tech. And it's completely worth probing that. And that's sort of like, even when you get into that debate, there's some really good ideas about it, but it's still just like, how do we adapt to this technology in a way that doesn't just give the power over to the government? And actually, the example you used is a great one, because in our government right now, our expanded federal government right now, they know exactly who you call. They can look it up. And the NSA has taken that power upon itself. And that's sort of what, if we extend that to the nationalization or further overreach of these private companies, which I think needs to happen to some extent, there are going to be advantages and disadvantages. And that's why I don't really think anybody on the left or the right has come to a consensus solution for this. But Ryan's point about nationalizing it, I think, is the one that probably comes closest at this point, because everything else is so weedy in the sort of like policy muck. It's very tempting to say, well, this is just so the middle ground thing is very, very galvanizing to people on the right, especially, Clarence Thomas's opinion that he wrote on this was great. It was very, clear-minded, but at the same time, it's like, how do you get people on board with these middle ground solutions that involve a lot of policy nuance? That's the difficult thing.
So, Emily, one last question before we let you go. In the reporting on this, the New York Times reported about this by calling the New York Post story unsubstantiated. Are we still calling this unsubstantiated? I wanted to get your take on this because I know you comment on media a lot, but are we still doing this with relation to Hunter Biden?
Absolutely. Of course we are. And because the Biden administration is. And so if the Biden administration is still in the ears of all of these dumbass reporters, I shouldn't have said that, but it's fine. If the Biden administration is still in their ears, then they're going to, that's an immense amount of pressure and access on the line just over a word or the way that you're treating the story. And so if they're still in your ears saying that you need to treat this as unsubstantiated, that's how it starts in the coverage like that, because the Biden administration has yet to really acknowledge what's going on with any of this. And so as long as the administration is pushing that line, you are going to see it echoed in the framing from the legacy media.
Right, and the claim that it's unsubstantiated is itself entirely unsubstantiated. Nothing in the report, other than maybe some details about how the material got out, has remotely been called into question. All of the emails, all of the evidence has only been confirmed and expanded on since then. Absolutely,
and it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't. No, all you have to do is say something is false, and then it just takes on the kind of ring of falsity, and that's where people leave it. It's a really disturbing state of affairs. So next on Rising, Andrew Fishman, a reporter from The Intercept, joins us to discuss protests in Brazil. Stick with us.